And welcome to this week's edition of Making Sense. And there's a lot of sense to be made when it comes to the automotive industry, especially if you are perhaps looking at a new car, looking at the second-hand car market, when you look at our local manufacturers, when you look at the imports of vehicles coming into our country. And then, of course, we start talking about tariffs. Now, I know you're probably going to say, I'm going on again about the Trump tariffs. Maybe, but in this case, it's actually one of our own tariffs, which could potentially impact how and when and what you can afford when it comes to the automotive industry and the next vehicle you might be buying. A bang for buck, value for money, all of those good things. Thankfully, there's someone much smarter than me that can help make sense of what these tariffs may become, specifically when it comes to the import of Chinese vehicles. He is the CEO of Auto Trader. Mr. George Mienie has very kindly agreed to join us on the podcast, and wonderful to see you again, George, by the way. And these tariffs make no sense to me. So I'll tell you why I don't think so in a few minutes. But first of all, on the proposed tariff increases for the importation of especially the Chinese brands, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
So amazing to be on your podcast. Love the studio. I think it's
Thanks.
I think it's really good use of the space. It almost feels like you're in a basement somewhere in the CIA.
We'll let you out afterwards. We promise. We haven't locked the doors.
On the tariffs, Gareth, I think 7% of South Africa's GDP is automotive vehicles exported out of our country, and the intent of the tariff increase is to protect our local market, but we have to be cognizant of our export market juxtaposed against these tariffs, and I'll get to that in a second. The first thing is the tariffs feel like, while the intent is good, it's a bit of a sledgehammer, and that sledgehammer is trying to do something that probably might be a little bit late to the party. Mm-hmm. What the intent of the tariff increase is supposed to do is incentivize and stimulate local manufacturing. Okay, but I don't think tariff increases alone will stimulate local manufacturing. We've got to be really cognizant of the fact that the vast majority of the vehicles manufactured in South Africa are exported, which means that local consumption of our own manufactured vehicles is low, and a lot of the vehicles consumed in South Africa are from imported sources. So where does that leave the consumer? Any increase in tariffs from an import perspective is going to flow directly down to the price of the car. Which the end user is going to have to absorb at some point. Exactly. And that's a bit like a sledgehammer, because with the Chinese imports as they are now, and we can get into some of the growth numbers of Chinese vehicles when we get there. But in some of those numbers, we can see where the consumer's mind is at. Where is the consumer's mind? The consumer's mind is less and less about the badge or the brand of the car, and more about the value that they're getting. The stuff they're getting for the money they're spending. Exactly. And the Chinese manufacturers have played directly into that delta. They're bringing in a car that is affordable, under, in many instances, 250, 300,000 rand, which was unthinkable a few years ago. Exactly. You look at vehicles like the Suzuki Swift. Suzuki Swift sells in I think it's under 28 days in this country. If it gets put up for sale, 28 days, it's gone. Now, the Suzuki Swift is an example. Secondhand, 200,000 rand, 250,000 rand, maybe a little bit higher than that for a new Suzuki Swift. But the point is really, what type of vehicle is it? It is a mid to low end vehicle in the sweet spot of what the consumer wants to pay for the value that they're getting. And more consumers are more I wouldn't say cost conscious, I'd say more value conscious, and turning over every rand because of our economic position or our economic conditions in the country. And when you say value conscious, I think what you mean by that, and tell me if I'm following you, is that you can pay the 250 or the 200,000, but they're going to look at other vehicles
in that segment and go, well, why must I pay the same amount for another vehicle when the Suzuki Swift, in this case, has everything and maybe more? I'll rather put my money there.
Exactly. So now enter the Chinese vehicles, right? Suzuki Swift doesn't have all the bells and whistles and technologies that a lot of the Chinese vehicles have. Chinese vehicle enters the market, 250, 300,000 rand for some of them, and suddenly you've got a bigger SUV. You've got a decent build quality. I wouldn't say the build quality is as good as the Europeans yet, but they're getting there very, very quickly. And you've got a lot of technology in the car. So for a similar price to a Suzuki Swift, you can buy a Chinese vehicle at a similar price point with a lot more value.
So that brings me to the point, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this, George, because you understand the industry so well, is instead of, and this was my argument a few weeks ago, instead of pushing up the tariffs on the Chinese cars, Chinese imports, to protect the local industry, why isn't the local industry making better quality cars for cheaper? Because in the end, the consumer is being hammered here, I think. But I failed Econ 101, so help me.
So that's an interesting question, because local manufacture often relies on local components or imported components. So the component industry is a very important part of the value chain of local manufacture. So if you imagine it this way, there is still taxes, ad valorem taxes, and import duties on raw materials and parts that we would have to import for local manufacture. And so I think the sledgehammer bit that I'm referring to is there is a wider ecosystem here that needs to be addressed and thought about before there will be stimulation for local manufacture. It's not just blocking international vehicles from coming to South Africa. I think it's part of the recipe, and the intent is good to stimulate local manufacture. But second to that, what is being done about components, component import, taxes on those component imports, so that we can lower the cost of local manufacture. I think one of the big reasons why most of our local manufactured vehicles are exported is because they are still just too expensive to put on our roads, and the Chinese have stepped directly into that gap.
So do you think this, in the end, if this plays out, and again, these are proposed tariffs right now as well, if this were to come to fruition, do you think it will protect the local industry? Do you think, you say some of the recipe and some of the ingredients is there, will it actually have the desired outcome? Or do you think this might be more just damaging for both the Chinese market and the local market and the consumers? Is it really going to achieve what it's trying to do?
That would depend on what step 2 and step 3 and step 4 is going to be. If it's purely just tariffs, then I think it could hurt the industry. Because if you look at the downstream effects, if imported vehicles are more expensive, right, that flows directly down to the consumer, unless there are local incentives, which I don't see. That flows directly down to the consumer. That 25% increase in tariffs, 25 to 50, is going to, or 18 to 50, is going to flow to the price of the car. Immediately, what happens is consumers go elsewhere to look for value. That elsewhere could be the second-hand market. So the second-hand market gets stimulated when new car prices start to rise. And when the second-hand market starts to get stimulated, initially you get a rise in prices. Dealers make a killing out of that because they're holding stock at a cheaper price, but now they can sell it for a more expensive price because there's more demand on used vehicles. But eventually that washes itself out, and the entire industry prices start to rise, even on second-hand vehicles. So this has a secondary impact, not only on new vehicles, but on second-hand vehicles as well.
So when you now look at the costs that we could be incurring on these Chinese vehicles, I suppose the other argument could then be, George, for the Chinese manufacturers to lower their cost of export to South Africa to still remain competitive? I know we're jumping between import prices and export prices, but China clearly, the Chinese vehicles clearly have a massive market here. And if they want to still remain as competitive post these tariffs, if they came in, they could also lower their cost to keep it competitive, can't they?
Yes. I mean, the one benefit China has versus South Africa is economies of scale.
Mm.
So, our manufacturing plants just can't produce the volumes because there's no demand for it, like the Chinese demand in China. So their economies of scale are massive compared to ours. Can they lower their prices even more? I mean, I know very little about geopolitics when it comes to China, but they already have subsidies on those vehicles that are imported into South Africa. The question is, can they lower those prices even more? Can they get more subsidies from their regulators or their governments? I don't know the answer to that. So I would imagine they're still operating at low margins, just like new vehicle manufacturers operate at in South Africa. And we probably are more pressed for margin than what they are because they've got the economies of scale. So I would imagine that if there are subsidies in China for Chinese exports, the question is, can those subsidies be increased by their government, and does their government want to do it?
Yeah, that's the real question.
Is our market big enough?
Do you think it is?
Our market's very small.
For the Chinese?
Yeah.
I would have thought it was huge. Okay.
Our market is very small in the context of China.
Okay.
In the context of Africa and what South Africa is, we're a big market. Europe's obviously a much bigger market than what we are. And so a lot of Chinese vehicles also go to Europe. So, in the end, where the ultimate risk is, if the sledgehammer isn't played out in step 2, step 3, and step 4, the risk is following the playbook that played out in Australia. Because in Australia, there's no more manufacturing. They're a net importer. And this exact scenario played out. And all we need to do is look across the pond at what happened there, and we will see what the future holds if we don't properly stimulate local manufacture. Now, that being said, the likes of Cherry are setting up plant, and hopefully there's no official news of this, so you can't take it as factual. But hopefully, BYD sets up plant here as well. And if that happens, I think the local market could be in a good place.
It could be, because then also there's local employment, even though it is an overseas manufacturer. I want to end this by just going back into your world specifically, that being Auto Trader as well. Now, even just the talk of tariffs, are you already seeing people beginning to look at the secondhand Chinese imports, or perhaps the used vehicles versus new? I mean, where does those two worlds of yours start colliding? When do you start pricking your ears up?
We haven't seen any indication in the numbers yet. The new to used vehicle sales ratio is still the same. It fluctuates anywhere between 1.5 and 2 used vehicles per new vehicle sold. That's probably the key ratio to watch. Is when there is stimulated used vehicle buying in the country, you'll see that ratio go up. More used vehicles traded in relation to the number of new vehicles sold in the country. That hasn't changed yet. I haven't seen evidence of rising used car prices. The average used vehicle listed on Auto Trader and sold through Auto Trader is still in and around 460 to 480,000 rand. That hasn't risen significantly. It's single digit over the last year, as a matter of fact. So maybe it's coming. It depends on whether these tariffs get through the gate, and then it remains to be seen what the secondary decisions are that our regulators take, because components, as I say, is a big issue. Maybe if I may, if we talk to new energy vehicles or electric vehicles for a second, therein lies another risk, because Europe is transitioning to cleaner, greener, new energy vehicles. The vehicles manufactured in South Africa at the moment that are exported are all internal combustion engine vehicles. So our local manufacturer is also at risk because of that transition in Europe. So if we raise these tariffs, we lock the country in to local manufacture and local consumption. Now you've got to ask yourself, is our local consumption enough to sustain a local plant? I don't think it is. We have to export in order to keep those plants going. We just don't have the volumes of consumption in order to sustain our own local market and have plants running to the degree that we need.
So it's not just the cars, it's also the manufacturing, it's also the industry, it's also the job-wide second-order effects as well. So I'm so glad I'm talking to you about this. I want to close this out by leaving any final thoughts with you. I like to do that on Making Sense. Anything I didn't ask that should be asked to make sense of this topic when it comes to the potential tariff increase, Chinese cars, what would you leave that to be? What is keeping you up at night on this topic?
I think two things. The first is, and I've kind of probably said it ad nauseum. I think that raw materials and imported parts and components is the underlying thing that a local manufacturer needs addressed by regulators. And then the second thing is our NEV transition. Are we doing enough from a consumer perspective to stimulate that part of the market? Because no manufacturer is going to set up plant in South Africa for an electric vehicle. Hybrids are probably a little bit different, but specifically for an electric vehicle, if there's no market to sell to. So I think components to keep our manufacturing alive, the import tariffs now, which has become the third thing, and then the NEV transition. What are we doing to de-risk our country in the NEV transition that's happening in Europe, because 7% of our GDP comes from local manufacture of new vehicles which are going over the border, and that's likely to decline.
Not good news. George Mienie, it's wonderful to have you on the show. I really appreciate the Auto Trader CEO, George Mienie, coming in and talking about it. As always, love to get your views, comments. You know where to leave them. Another edition of Making Sense coming up next week. I hope this did make sense. It's a complicated topic, and I'm grateful that George could come in and talk to us. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.